You're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled Alien Queen Mocked Humanity until she carried his child best HFY sci-fi story. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. It began with a sound that did not belong to any sky. A high, serrated laughter that came from instruments older than memory, a chorus wired into the bones of a dead world. The laughter flowed through the halls of the sovereign Maw, the flagship palace of Xirathe, queen of the Shatari Dominion, as easily as blood through an artery. It rattled through pillars grown from dark crystal and swam across floors that shimmered with captive starlight. It was a queen's pleasure at the uselessness of another species' last stand. They thought human tenacity amusing. They had for centuries. The galaxy, after all, measured time with civilizations as beads on a string. The Shatari did not count centuries or dynasties. They counted extinctions. In the slow ebb of the universe's long breath, they had been constant. The tide that never receded, the patient undertaker, the archivist of conquered suns. So when whispers arrived from their vassals about a species from a blue-brown world beyond the Orion Gate, a species that built ships out of scars and dared to send music through the dark, Xirathe laughed. She seated herself upon a throne petrified by gravity's fist and declared that humanity would be a lesson, as so many had been, a case study in the futility of hope. The case study did not cooperate. The first ship that wandered into Shatari Holdings was the colony carrier Horizon Dawn, a ribbon of steel and garden domes, its hull scratched by the teeth of asteroid ice and meteor grit. When it stumbled into forbidden space, it did not flee. It broadcast 1,000 hellos. The Shatari answered with silence and nets of living cable. The captain, a man with tired eyes named Elias Rourke, tried to point his ship away. The nets tightened. The Dominion's emissaries sent a message in the open band: kneel and be categorized. Rourke opened a channel and smiled the kind of smile that belongs to humans at the edges of cliffs. "We kneel at graves," he said, "not before them." Then the Horizon Dawn fought. It was not a fair fight. A carrier against a swarm meant to devour fleets. Bioceramic dreadnoughts whose hulls bent starlight, skirmishers that drank radiation, lances that spat programmable lightning. The Horizon Dawn used every trick her crew had learned from journeys no archive recorded. They turned their own atmosphere into a weapon, vented it into the faces of boarding leeches, and set it on fire. They rerouted failing reactors into their railguns and cracked the carapace of a hunter the size of a city block. When ammunition ran empty, they fired their dead. They hurled coffins with directional charges welded inside. They fought until the ship was no more than a burning rib cage drifting through screams. When the Horizon Dawn finally split, she took 6 Shatari capital bodies into her grave. The galaxy breathed in at that number, 6. The Dominion wrote it down. The Shatari had a word for curiosity, but it was cousin to a word for hunger. Xirathe leaned forward on her throne and looked at the feed. In his last moments, Captain Rourke had asked to transmit a message. He stared through cracked glass and blood and said, "We're coming." Then he was gone. A small thing, but small things gather. Humanity became a rumor that bled into a story that bled into a pattern. They did not have the Dominion's millennia of breeding pits and archive symmetries. They had the unwise courage of a species that had learned to make fire inside caves and then refused to leave the flame alone. They made engines sing past their intended octaves. They made steel remember it had once been part of rocks that held mountains and taught it how to be a spine again. They made promises to their dead, and those promises tasted like iron. Planets they loved burned. Oceans boiled. Cities lifted and folded in on themselves like flowers whipped into winter. And each time the Shatari thought it done, another human ship clawed out of the dark. Each time the Dominion's analysts diagrammed the collapse of human morale, another transmission leaked through the noise, a lullaby sung from a bunker to a child who would never see the sun. Those lullabies did something odd to the war. They gave it shape. They gave it a face, too. The face had a scar that cut from the cheekbone to the jaw, and a pair of gray eyes that looked like weather rolling in over an empty field. His name was Jonathan Hale. He had commanded a frigate at Mars and a carrier over Europa. He had watched red sands bloom and consume, watched the purge burn his daughter in the cold of vacuum, while she still held a stuffed bear by one ear inside the observation ring. There were careful words for what happened to him after that, clinical words, words for the psychological archives. None of those words mattered. Hale kept living when there wasn't a point. He stood up when he should have stayed down, and other people, even the ones who had lost their will, found theirs again by watching him. They called him the last light because lights go out. He didn't. When the Admiralty became ash ships and empty chairs, the network chirped with an unassigned call sign, a voice that refused to be recorded fully. Hale's voice began and ended pushes across the ragged front. His commands were simple. They sounded like hold. They sounded like not yet. They sounded like laughter that hurt. He took a Corvette named Valiant and welded her to a pack of scraps and dreams until she felt as heavy as a legend. He drove her into places where star charts became lies. The war turned toward a region the maps called the Veil Cluster. It was not a place that welcomed maps. Ion storms powered by the tantrums of infant pulsars spun through those starfields, and the dust of unmade planets smoked through those corridors like the lungs of a god. The Shatari had a home there, a fortress that had once been a star. They grew it with the patience of coral, feeding it with the biomass of conquered seas and the skins of dead cultures. They called it Kulthar in their internal speech, a word whose root meant memory that must be guarded. Translated to human tongues, it meant simply, the heart. Hale called the fleet. He counted ships and came up with 42 that could jump. 42 against 2,000 catalogued Shatari hulls with more waiting and incubation vats inside Kulthar. The admirals, such as Remain, told him to wait for a miracle that had never shown up before. Hale said, "We don't wait for miracles, we cause regret." And those 42 went with him, not because math made sense, but because grief did. The assault on the heart took shape like weather over a flat sea. It built in bands. Human destroyers lanced at the outer pickets, detonating mines with their armored faces until the mines ran out of patience. Frigates slithered under the arcs of lightning where they could. When they couldn't, they died with their bows pointed the right way. Hale drove Valiant through a gap that was only a gap if you believed distance was real, if you believed time was as sequential as old books said. What happened inside the Veil was 3 days long and 1,000 years wide. Shatari post-battle reports, those that survived, read like music scored for screams. On the third day, Valiant alone flickered and bled. Her name, painted in chipped letters by children aboard a hospital ship at Titan, was half burnt away. The Sovereign Maw stood between Hale and Kulthar's core, a creature ship that wore a palace like a crown and breathed gravity. Hale stood at a console whose lights were mostly untrue and looked at the gaping jaw of a dreadnought that had never been terrified. He rolled his shoulder where a shard of shrapnel had made a permanent home. He thought of his daughter with the bear. He said to the ship, which was not awake but did her best to be loyal, "Ram the heart." The crew looked at him. The crew didn't need to ask. Orders work like prayers when you're empty enough. The wreck named Valiant went where it was told. The collision was not a crash so much as two philosophies making contact. The Sovereign Maw shattered enough for a wound, enough for the palace to list and bleed, enough for Xurath to stand up. Hale did not die in the impact. The universe had more use for him. Shatari recovery tendrils ran through the wreck like curious snakes. They retrieved the man who dared. They put him in a cocoon that pumped the atmosphere of his home at the edge of his lips. They brought the cocoon into a hall where Xirathe waited in the gravity of her quiet. Her skin did not have a single color. It held layers of shadow and iridescence like oil water under night. Her eyes were not eyes. They were mirrors that reflected your own face with edits that made you honest. Her hair was a translation error, a forest of living fiber-optics, perhaps, or a crown of nerves. She had worn the names of queens, tyrants, mothers of worlds. She had watched species kneel. She had not watched them refuse this long. She told herself she was curious. "Do you understand where you are?" she asked, and when her voice came through the translator lattice, it wore a human lilt that had never belonged to her. He opened his eyes. He was strapped to a table grown from bone and the memory of marble. The smell in the hall made him remember the underside of storms on Earth, petrichor and something electric. He was not afraid of this kind of death. He had already died in other rooms. He looked at her and saw an enemy. He looked at her again and past the animal honesty of her face saw something else, intelligence with nothing to stand against it and therefore nothing to temper it. He found his voice where it had gone to hide. "You're the one who laughs," he said. Her head tipped an angle. "I am the one who remembers. You remember our dead." His tone made the question hoarse. "I remember all dead," she answered. "It is how one learns to write history. Your kind believes in it. You write your dead into books and then pretend the words keep you warm." "Sometimes they do," he said. "Sometimes that's enough." "Your ship struck mine," she said. "A demonstration, an insult, a scream." "An answer," he said. That was the first of their conversations. The Dominion would bottle 100 more into crystalline vials and label them for study. Across days with no clocks, across hours measured by breaths and the hum of the dying sovereign maw's cauterized guts, she asked him questions that moved from tactics to meaning and back again. She asked why humans fought after losing everything that framed a fight. He told her that frames break and persistence is the picture. He told her about mothers who pin medals on empty suits because the instant of doing gives time bones again. He told her about hunger not for food but for mornings, and how even when mornings start fresh carnage, they owe you a beginning. He told her about a child who held a bear when the stars turned red and he did not cry in front of a queen. The palace recalibrated its lights. The sovereign maw, lamed but not dead, sang lullabies to itself. Inside those songs, something peculiar took root. Xirathe had always examined her enemies to eat them better. She had never studied to become less hungry. The man on the table spoke in the language of losses stacked like cairns, and the cairns, in his mouth, were not monuments to despair, but to route finding. She had never considered a vector that chose grief and used it as fuel. She did what all intelligent minds do when they have gotten away with cruelty too long. She became afraid of a new thing. She stopped the fleets. It happened quietly at first, a pause order here, a recall there, each dressed in the language of logistics. A queen can delay without being questioned, but the Shatari had watched her for surviving centuries. They noticed a softness not like weakness but like heat reached for with an ungloved hand. They whispered. They wondered. In the corridors groaned for plotting. The generals of purity spoke the way predators do when they scent a wound. When she arrived in the cocoon room one day not to interrogate but to speak without the shell of her titles, her body wore a configuration meant to translate elegance into human seeing. She looked almost like a woman he could meet on a blasted street waiting for a bus that would never arrive. That might have been why she looked wrong. That might have been why she felt right. "Teach me," she said simply, "not how to win. I have learned that word too well. Teach me how to endure what I have done." He stared at her a long time. He had wanted to put a bullet into her skull since the first scream of a world falling into her vats. The idea that forgiveness could be an act of war had not occurred to him as a strategy. He did not forgive. That is not what happened. He nodded once anyway. "It won't save you," he said. "I do not want salvation," she said. "I want to change shape." So he taught as men whose bones are tired still teach, not lessons with chalk, stories. He told her about a planet that wore blue and brown. He told her sobbing jokes about the price of coffee and the way New Delhi's nights smelled when the monsoon flirted with the city. He spoke the names of human dead as if the speaking fit stones back together around the edges. He said the word love once and then didn't say it again for a while. He spoke of work, the kind that doesn't end, the kind that looks like carrying water forever to a fire that keeps growing. He taught her the human trick of sitting with guilt without using it as a leash to whip yourself bloody, of letting guilt be a compass pointing at repairs. She did a thing she had never done. She walked among survivors. She opened the maw's holds and permitted the humans, those held for study, those kept for ransom that would never come, to leave. She escorted a child to an airlock and watched the child's hand squeeze a battered bear, and felt something in her abdomen that had nothing to do with physiology coil and then uncurl. She altered the Dominion's 300-year plan by a millimeter, and saw where the millimeter would lead when extrapolated across the next 100,000 hours, away from the gleam of annihilation and into fog. When she came to him in her not-quite-human shape, when she asked him for things that had nothing to do with war, the galaxy, if the galaxy were a person, would have held its breath. A queen and her enemy do not become something so soft, but they did, because softness, like surrender, is often confused with the strength of choosing not to kill. He did not love her immediately. He did not love her easily. He lay with her in a room that tried to simulate summer. The simulation failed and made the air smell like the ghost of cut grass. He thought of his wife's hair, the way it had smelled when she leaned over the crib. He put his mouth against a creature who had murdered worlds. He put his mouth against change. She conceived. Shatari physiology held more secrets than light. Hybridization had occurred in their long history, always to the devouring of the lesser. None had held human stubbornness in the code of their blood. Inside her, cells sang at odd intervals. A metronome changed time signatures. In a chamber lined with membranes that remembered oceans, she felt the first odd flutter and knew fear differently. She placed her hand on her abdomen and understood that history's longest notes break on a single breath. The Dominion discovered, courts do not keep secrets when those secrets can be weaponized. The Shatari purists stripped bone minarets off conquered moons to build a fleet meant to cauterize an idea. Their messages used the syntax of survival. The queen has become vessel for corruption. Remove the error. Burn the contagion. Purity is another word for cowardice when it fears, and fear made their lances bright. Xirathe fled. She did not flee alone. Hale did not leave her side. Perhaps because the war had reduced all other choices to ash. Perhaps because endurance, when you start it, must be practiced like breathing. They took the remnants of human ships, salvage stitched to weapons assembled out of memory and anger, and they took those Shatari who had watched their queens change and seen not weakness but a path out of the long hunger. They named themselves nothing. The galaxies would later name them the Concord of Ashes. That name fit because they built their city where fire had already been. They made their base in the shadows of Xirathe, a moon scarred by the skeletons of mining colonies that had gone still. They grew gardens in the carbon black with lights that mimicked dawn. They let children draw chalk suns on the ribs of the broken mine shafts. The queen carried the child that would be both dagger and olive branch with a concentration she had never used for conquest. Hale taught her to breathe through pain, as if breath were string-stitching a tear. He told her stories into the place where her heart would be if it were human, and said words meant for a daughter who had once owned a bear. He did not call this forgiveness either. He called it duty, which is sturdier. The purest fleets arrived like weather change. They did not build sieges, they made blitz. Millions of grown hulls, each with a memory of killing layered into the lattice of their armor, poured into Xirathe's sky. They became a storm that left claw marks in the atmosphere's thinness. The first barrages chewed Karath's old mines into shrapnel and turned the air into a thin soup of ions and blood. The Concorde met them with everything left. Frying pan fighters strapped with the last railguns left in the sector, arcs of cheap missiles, drone swarms that had once been agricultural pollinators repurposed to sting. Humans crawled into suits that leaked and taped the leaks and went anyway. Shatari defectors spat lightning at their cousins and felt their old programming buckle. Hale walked the barricades like a lit fuse. He dragged cables with hands that had broken too many times to count and stopped to adjust the sight on a recruit's rifle with the gentleness of a surgeon setting a bone. He lit the field radios with his voice. "Hold," he said. "Not yet." He turned his head toward a sky peeled open and saw shapes so huge the child in him curled up to make itself small. He didn't let the child drive. He touched the holograph of Karath and drew circles where their lines looked weakest, because circles look like promises. He slept for 20 minutes against a bulkhead and dreamed of water. In the garden chamber where Karath's core heat now fed rows of hand-built incubators, Xirathe labored. She worked with the concentration she had held when she had orchestrated the genocide of a bright people who wrote epics on mirrors of water. Concentration now turned toward life. Shatari midwives who had once eulogized her victims constructed scaffolds of bio-loom and beat the rhythm of ancient songs on the walls. Hale stood outside the membrane and listened to sounds human men had cherished beside human women for 1,000,000 years. The music of children coming were the same no matter the throne they stepped under. He heard the quake of shells above. He tasted iron fear. He pressed his hand against the membrane. Xirathe pressed hers against the other side. Their fingers made a ghostly print through translucence. That's what love looked like when you were building a bridge out of ash. The purest second wave breached the outer lines. The third wave blew the hangars open. The fourth wave killed the light for a moment and made the garden chamber feel like the inside of a mouth about to chew. In the half-dark, a cry broke the air into shards. It was small, staggered, commanding like tides. The child's first breath hitched and then found the old rhythm all children of lungs find. Xirathe cradled something golden not in color but in implication. The baby's skin shimmered with translucent veins that glowed in slow pulses. Its eyes opened and read the room without fear. Hale stepped through the membrane that would cut him if he were unwelcome and found it soft. He looked at the child and saw no forgiveness. He saw future. That was enough. "Show me," the queen said, her voice thinner than war and larger than kingdoms. He took the bundled child with the humility of a soldier receiving the last bullet and kissed its forehead with a mouth that had mostly been used to speak orders. The skin was warm as bread. He looked at Xirathe and the world resolved. He had not expected such resolve to taste like this. Not victory, not reprieve, simply rightness. He nodded once. He did not say the words he felt. Men learn economy of speech when the minutes are expensive. He carried the child to the threshold where the hall met the corridor and listened to the walls shake. Then he turned away from the safe light and toward the scream. That day had a night that never arrived. Karath's sky stuttered with lightning. The seventh wave scraped the Concorde until it bled names. The eighth wave broke the barricades and poured invaders through. Inside the corridors, humans made themselves into doorways. Shatari defectors let their bodies be bridges. One soldier stood on a flight of metal steps and emptied a magazine into the mouth of a purest heavy until the heavy lost the memory of standing. When the magazine clicked empty, the soldier threw the gun. When it cracked a carapace, he drew a knife. When the knife broke, he yelled. The yelling did nothing. It did everything. Hale became more wound than man. He took a blast to the shoulder that would have killed him if he had belonged to a reasonable species. He kept going because the next step is all endurance needs. He held a corridor with a handful of people who were already ghosts and promised the ghosts they would matter. He kicked an explosive drone down a stairwell and did not watch it bloom because there was no time. He reached the last corridor before the garden chamber and found 3 Shatari heavies already hammering at the membrane. He had 4 bullets. The math was impolite. He made it polite by moving. He put 2 rounds into the first heavy's joints. He put 1 round into the second heavy's mouth when it opened to laugh. He had created the wrong kind of poetry, left 1 round for 2 problems and himself. He solved the first problem by throwing his body into it. His skull cracked against a bony jaw with a sound like a fist into raw meat. The heavy fell. The last heavy aimed a lance. Hale saw all the math and did not move his feet. He lifted his chin the way his daughter had once lifted hers when dared to jump into a lake. "Come and take him," he said, because sometimes short sentences are taller than mountains. A beam hammered his chest. It burned through what was left of the plating. It turned the suture over his rib to smoke. He tasted ozone and memory and felt the world tilt to its side. He went to a knee. He did not drop the child. Xirathe arrived as a woman and a queen at once. Something moved through her that had not existed before. The protective rage of mothers who have held bleeding worlds and bleeding infants and decided which to heal first. She threw a hand forward and 1,000 thin threads of bio-light whipped from her fingers and wrapped the heavy's weapon and folded it like paper. Her other hand speared into the heavy's head, not to extract vengeance but to extract the seed of the purest order. She tore the seed out. It looked like a dark pearl. She crushed it in 2 fingers. She looked at Hale and saw the light under his skin flicker. She took the baby and pressed it with a sob to her breast. The heavies were not the last. They were only the beginning of the inside fighting. War in corridors is personal. It is teeth and breath and footsteps on metal. It is promises about who you will be to a child you named 20 minutes ago. The fighting lasted 7 more hours. Xirathe's thin air learned a new taste that day and would never forget. When the last body hit the floor, it sounded like a book closing. The Concorde counted. They counted backwards from all they had lost and forwards from the one they had gained. There were not enough left to call it a nation. That is not what they needed. They needed enough to carry the child. And carry they did. They ran. Xirathe carved a path through her own kind with hands she had taught to create. Hale walked by her side with trouble in his breath. He smiled once to a boy who had brought him water in a strip of tarp. The boy would remember the curl of that smile when the gods came to ask for offerings. Hale turned and looked at the sky. The purest fleet hovered like a lid. He felt the lids of his eyes grow heavy. He put a palm against the hatch that led to the last tunnel. He had promised to keep a corridor. He had kept it. He did not have to keep this one. "Go," he told Xirathe. She could have ordered him. He would have disobeyed. She learned that kind of mathematics quickly. She reached a hand to his face, fingers cool like stone fed by spring water. "If you stay," she said, "I will never forgive myself." "If I go, I won't either," he said. He made a fist against his chest as if adjusting armor that no longer fit. "Someone has to hold the door. And if the door closes behind you," she asked, voice cracking on the last word, a continent caving into sea. "Make another," he said. She looked at him. "It has always been terrible and holy. The moment you choose to leave the love you have for the love you might protect." She went. He turned. He faced the corridor with a rifle he finally let fall. He picked up a length of pipe. He became a hinge given human shape. What happened next belongs to choruses. Songs are truer than reports when the subject is sacrifice. Hale held the corridor for 3 minutes by the clock, an hour by the heart, a season by the soul. He did not die soft. He died like a building burning without collapsing. A skeleton remembering it had been a mountain, a prayer said not for oneself but for a species. When his body finally found the floor, the purists in that corridor stepped around him. Not out of mercy. Out of respect the way predators respect a bull too brave to taunt. The tunnel Xirathe took opened 2 days later into the throat of an unlicensed carrier with scavenger markings and a heart too big for its hull. They jumped when the geometry allowed. Xirathe became an afterimage that would never leave their dreams. The purest fleet consumed the moon until nothing but shards and the taste of regret remained. The Dominion's generals called it a victory. Their throats sounded hoarse when they said so. Every species understands a funeral even when it can't pronounce the names of the dead. The queen did not call herself a queen. She called herself mother. With the Concorde's remnant, she went to ground. In the shadows between commerce and confiscation, on worlds that had hidden under the Dominion so long they had become moss, she made small miracles that looked like paperwork and stolen water filtration units. She taught Shatari midwives to swaddle with human cloth and human women to sing to a child with a strange pulse. The baby grew, not with the speed of Shatari hatchlings or the slowness of human infants, but with a rhythm between. The glow beneath his skin patterned itself into constellations at night when he slept. They named him Aaron, a name from a sea that no longer washed a continent's feet. It meant valley. It meant shelter. Aaron's laugh could change the feeling of a room. Xirathe's hands learned clumsy human things, chopping vegetables, fixing the bent wheels of a wagon, catching a falling child with the instinct that does not belong to a species at war, but to a mammal protecting its own. She sat in a chair under a sun that did not know it witnessed revolution and held him to her chest, and the biolume patterns flowing beneath her skin pulsed in rhythm with his breath. She would teach him history that did not flatten the dead into numbers. She would teach him how to stand in front of a door and be worth the hinge. The Dominion did not release them. Power rarely forgets a challenge so direct. The purists hunted the mother and child with a fervor that looked like religion because it was. The worship of a past too terrified to allow a future. Battles weren't grand anymore. They were small and constant. They were stolen fuel and engines clanking back to life under the hands of mechanics who had once made harvesters. They were the fight for a room for a night, a meal for a morning. That long, slow fight is the kind that kills powers built for spectacle. In those small battles, species bled into one another softly. A Shatari artisan placed her palm against a human child's fevered brow and crooned a song made of clicks and coos that had once meant hunting. The fever broke. A human doctor held a Shatari soldier's hands while the soldier learned the meaning of shaking, of crying, of breaking and knowing it meant you weren't broken. Xirath learned to accept bowls of soup from people who had seen her face on the sky and pointed, and instead of throwing rocks had whispered, she carried a child. They never wrote it on a wall, but it became a proverb. She who carries a child carries a world. Aaron learned to walk under 2 gravities and speak 2 languages that left steam in the air in different shapes. When he fell, he pushed up the way human children do. When he looked at a lattice of light, he understood how to twist it into another pattern the way Shatari children do. He grew watching his mother trade jewelry that had once signified dominion for grain. He grew listening to his father's name said like a prayer and a warning. He grew as children always grow, with people around him who did their best in the ruins of their worst. Not all stories bend toward peace because of good hearts. Sometimes they bend because they must. The Dominion, in its hunger for its own earlier version, spent itself like a gambler who has mortgaged the future. The purists counted their purity like coins and found themselves poor. They burned fuel without replacing the wells. They bred ships without remembering they required fields. Their paperwork curdled. Their decrees sounded brittle. Their soldiers began to do the math in their heads and then reported sick the days they were ordered to hunt nurseries. Empires die slower than people like to hope and faster than they predict. The Dominion began to leak at the seams it had pretended were iron. Xirath did not simply wait. She did not have a taste for idleness after a million decisions. She turned the Concorde's remnants into stitches. They stitched across wounds that had no business healing. They found water under dry worlds and taught hands how to coax it up. They opened wormholes with finesse rather than violence and guided food through to places where hunger had sharpened teeth. It is easier to teach people to follow an idea when that idea feeds their children. The idea had a face, too. Aaron's. A child with a star under his skin who laughed like a welcome and cried like justice. No sequel to any war had ever looked exactly like him. Years carried them. Years do that. They pick you up, placing you in rooms you never expected to enter. Aaron became tall without warning. He could run the spine of a drifting hull and leap the gap to the melody of another ship's breathing like he had always belonged in airlessness. He could sit at a table where old enemies talked and repeat back to them what they had not dared to say to themselves. He learned to stand at his mother's shoulder when she faced armed men and not flinch. He learned to walk in front when a crowd needed someone to choose the direction. He learned to mourn. The news came from a man made of wires and fatigue, a relic from Xirathe who had escaped a slow death in a mine labor gasper. The relic held a chip with a slice of video on it. It showed Jonathan Hale at a corridor's mouth, shoulders scorched, eyes as bright as iron pulled from the fire. It showed the moment the beam struck and he did not let go. It showed the fall. There were no words at the end. Aaron watched the video 5 times. On the 6th, he put his forehead down on the table and did not move. Xirathe held his head and rocked back and forth and made a sound older than language. That sound is how species know they belong to mammals. She had known Hale had died. Knowing changed nothing and everything. The child pressed their grief into the floorboards which creaked and remembered. Grief is slow fuel. It burns cleaner than rage and longer than adrenaline. With that fuel, they finished what the purists had accidentally started by trying to cauterize an idea. The Dominion did not explode. It unraveled. The last of the fearless generals sat down in green rooms and drank tea made by hands once forced to pour it and said, "Please." Xirathe obliged with a stern mercy, forgiveness braided with bills. She did not absolve genocide. She set people to labor building what they had annihilated. She did not call this justice. She called it math. On a day whose date would be carved into both Shatari and human calendars with a shared font. On a day whose light made dust dance in beams through a window cut into the side of a repurposed dreadnought now christened a town hall, Aaron stood in front of both species. The hall had once echoed with the songs of conquest. It now smelled of bread. It held men who had cried war and now held their grandchildren asleep on their shoulders. It held women who had forged weapons and now darned blankets with the same precise fingers. It held the universe in miniature. Stubborn, repentant, exhausted, hungry for mornings. Aaron placed both palms on the podium. His skin glowed faintly as it always did when he breathed deeply. He did not make speeches because he had prepared them. He made speeches because they were what he had to offer. He looked at his mother. He looked at the place on the wall where men and women had chalked words. Hale kept the door. He looked at the old purist, face lined into maps, sitting in the front row holding the hand of a child with mixed blood and mixed future. "My father," Aaron said, and the words softened the corners of the room. "My father was a hinge. You know hinges by what they permit. They do not command. They enable. He kept the door open for us. My mother was a different kind of door. She closed one, the door of a long empire, and placed her body against it so it would not swing back. I am here because they did both. We are here because you chose not to make a god out of your shame and worship it forever." He paused and the silence swelled. He turned his hands over so the glow faced them more fully. It made him look less like a symbol and more like a boy with a trick of light. "We are not here to promise no more war. Promise is cheap. We are here to endure. Between floods, between famines, between failures, we will carry water. We will repair beams. We will write names so the dead do not forget us. We will make small brave choices. We will raise children who carry doors for others. We will live like hinges." He stepped down. The room exhaled. Xirathe closed her eyes and let a tear fall. It tasted of iron and ocean. She felt her crown, a thing she had not worn in years, growing lighter. She felt her son's hand brush her wrist. She turned her palm and caught his fingers. She saw in his face the mathematics of the future add up to something she could not have computed before. A ledger that balanced not in favor of conquest or mercy, but of endurance. Time did not stop. It has a rudeness that way. Whole worlds no longer exploded because a queen grew bored, but storms still came. A disease slipped through a colony and taught them brushes are as vital as bullets. A famine nipped at the edges of a sector until freighters, manned by people who had once killed one another without thinking, learned to form convoys like geese in autumn. Piracy flared and was curbed not solely by force but by shame. We do not steal from our hungry became something children repeated to tease each other when they stole sweets. Xirathe aged in ways that had nothing to do with biology. Aaron began to gray at the temples like his father had. He wore the streaks with gentleness. He learned to forgive less and repair more. They did not write a constitution with all the right words first try. The first version bled in the streets and said sorry with its hands. The second version took the time to count the people who could not count for themselves. The third version learned from the songs played by warehouse workers at dawn. Democracy, copied clumsily from old human tapes, translated roughly into Shatari Alien, and then replayed in the rhythms of shared work, became less a system than a practice. A thing done daily like sweeping floors. Some who had wanted the empire back went home and sulked. They put on their old uniforms in bedrooms and looked at themselves in mirrors and realized they preferred their grandchildren's drawings on the walls to their medals. The only figure who remained consistently absent was the one whose absence held them shape. Jonathan Hale did not return. Ghosts are consistent that way. He visited in stories told the way good carpenters show you how to hold a tool. Hale would have stood here, someone would say, drawing an X on a floorboard and then standing there themselves. Hale would have said hold. A nurse would murmur over a child burning with fever, and she would hold his hand all night and sing in 2 languages until the fever bent. When the memorial was finally built, it rose not as a tower but as a gate. A simple thing, 2 uprights and a beam, built from the wreck of the Valiant's last spar. Children ran through it shrieking. Lovers met under it and kissed. Old men sat on a bench in its shade and chewed bitter leaves and criticized good decisions. On certain mornings, when the sun angled right, the beam's shadow laid across the ground like a corridor. Sometimes, standing in that shadow, Xirathe felt fresh grief like a knife. She let it cut. Scars teach you where you end and the story begins. Aaron grew into leadership as a tree grows into space offered and space carved. He learned to deflect worship deftly. Worship breaks the backs of leaders and distorts the spines of followers. He did not want to be a god. He wanted to be a person who held both his parents inside him without forcing them to reconcile. He argued with his mother often. They did it in public when the argument taught something. They did it in private when the argument had fangs. He did not always win. He did not always lose. He learned the distinction between winning and helping. When the last purist holdout finally sent envoys, thin with hunger and thick with stories about righteousness, Aaron met them in a field planted with wheat from Earth's old seed banks. He let them walk the rows. He let them breathe the smell of the gold. He let them feel small next to something not about them. They talked under a willow that had learned to drink thin soil. He did not humiliate them. He did not vindicate them. He asked them to carry water for a week. They did. On the 8th day they cried without knowing why. On the 9th they stayed. Peace is not a cliff you reach. It is the dirt path around a mountain. It is the way you keep choosing to go left around a rock when the right offers a plunge that would excite your blood. The Concord learned to plant not just wheat but institutions. They learned that archives are as vital as armories because both store the tools you need when the weather changes. They learned that lullabies belong in the official record. They learned to tell the truth to their children, and then to ask their children to tell the truth back when the older generation lied to spare itself shame. The story the galaxy told about humanity changed. It had been butcher and bastard, pest and paladin, a species whose hands shook because they were always holding knives. Now the word picked up new weight in markets and nurseries and courts. When a new species made the mistake of raiding a convoy near the Veil and expected to be conquered for it, Aaron sent them engineers instead. "You're stealing food because your reactors went bad," he said. "We had bad reactors once. We can show you how to fix them." The raiders lowered their heads because gratitude and shame share a room. The convoy got through. The raiders did not die. You can call that victory or you can call it endurance. Both mean the people on the convoy ate. The old queen, who wore no crown and signed papers with a child on her lap long after the child was a man, watched the edges of her sight go gray. She did not fear death. She had sent so many ahead of her that she only hoped the dead would let her sit with them by a river and explain what she had done with her last years. She held a ribbon of cloth sometimes, plain and brown, taken from the shirt of a man who had rammed his ship into her palace. She rubbed it between her fingers the way a monk might rub beads. She did not call it penance. She called it remembering. She had said once that she was the one who remembers. It was still true. Memory is not a knife if you hold it right. It is a needle. On the last day she asked to be taken to the gate. Not carried, taken. Aaron walked on one side. A woman who had once fought against him and now ran the water ministry walked on the other. Children darted ahead and held skipping ropes out of the way. People made room without making a fuss, which is one of the greatest kindnesses. Xirathe stood under the beam and looked at the shadow it made. She saw a corridor. She heard a voice she had not heard in meat and air in many years say, "Hold." She smiled. She put her hand on the beam as if it were a shoulder. "I will," she said. She turned to Aaron and touched his cheek with fingers that had learned the human muscle map from the inside. "When you speak," she told him, "let silence be your companion. When you listen, listen until your bones ache. When you fight, fight like a hinge. When you love, love in the open." He put his forehead against hers. Their skins glowed together. He breathed out, so did she. So did the gathered crowd, quietly without cue. She sat on the bench. She closed her eyes. She went where the dead go, which is not our business to describe, carrying with her 1,000 worlds worth of history stitched into a single design. Aaron did not cry there. He cried later in a storage room that smelled of oil and raincoats. He put his face into his hands and remembered a man standing in a doorway and not letting it close. He stood up when he was ready. He went back out to the day. The story you have heard is not a myth. It happened the way the best stories always happen. They are born in rooms where someone picks up a thing too heavy and then causes it to move anyway. The galaxy had learned to say the word human with respect and with a wary smile. Humanity had learned to say the word Shatari with something other than curse or prayer. In markets, the two species haggled and flirted and learned how jokes changed shape when told by a mouth with 3 tongues. In schools, children traced the Veil cluster on old maps and placed stickers where the Concord had turned battles into bridges. In kitchens, people warmed soups with old recipes and new spices and sat down to eat side by side. If we end here, we end not with trumpets but with breathing. Hale would have wanted that. Xirathe would have tolerated it and then smiled. Aaron would have nodded and gone to a meeting about grain shipments. People do not live inside climaxes. They live in middles and in endings that insist on becoming beginnings. They endure, not because they like pain, because they like mornings. There is a plaque under the gate. It is small. People walk past it and brush it with their fingers the way one does a luck charm, the way one does a scar. It reads in a human tongue and in the Shatari knots that mean the same, hold. Above it, the beam keeps the sky off. Children run through. Lovers meet. Old men argue. The door remains open. When storms come, the hinges complain and then do their jobs. Ships still steer past the veil. Some stop and float on their bellies and let the ion storms comb their metal hair. Some sing into the dark in 2 languages just to hear the echoes. If you lean your ear against the hull and listen, you might hear a laugh. Not the serrated laughter that began this long business. A better laugh. The kind that makes a room less heavy. The kind that belongs to people who have found a way to live not as conquerors but as carriers. The sound will make you think of an old man with a scar, and a queen with hands that learn to cradle, and a boy with light under his skin. It will make you feel like eating bread with your hands and sharing it. When you arrive at a world where the gate stands, when you feel small under the beam that used to belong to a ship, remember how smallness is useful in a universe that goes on without you. Stand in the shadow that looks like a corridor. Imagine yourself the hinge. Do not wait for permission to be human. It has always been yours. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.